Hi, I want to make a video on the subject of subjective and objective, and how liking is subjective and being is objective. This shouldn't be a long video because this has been regurgitated over and over again, at least in videos I've made. But yeah, you exist as a being, and you exist objectively in a world that's objective, regardless of what you're liking or you dislike in your opinions. They exist on an objective basis. The opinions that you're existing in, your subjective opinions exist in an objective world. They subjectively exist in an objective world, yes. They exist separately and differently, but that doesn't mean that they are not in the same existence. Your being is in the same existence, therefore your liking and all those things that come from your being, are all objective. They all exist, and the existing and the being is the part, not only just the being, and the world, but the existing part is all objective, and the liking and whatever the disliking, it doesn't mean anything beyond the same at a certain point, because it's just um, you exist, your liking exists, and it's separate, but it's just differently objective. Like I've mentioned before, it's something that exists on a objective basis. It's just different than someone else's. An opinion, just because it's ethereal, it doesn't exist physically, doesn't mean it can be ascribed to be subjective. Like these things that are considered ethereal, these things that you can't touch or feel, are all of a sudden considered subjective things. All of a sudden, it can't be touched, it's subjective. Air can be whatever delusion you want to have to whatever you consider ethereal or whatever it is. But regardless of these things that were perceived as ethereal, the idea of things that are thin air that can't be touched, that is subjective. It's not subjective. It's all in the same capsule. It's all in the same globe. It's all in the same protective casing. It's all in the same thing. It's all in the same universe, reality. It's existing, regardless of what you think. Your thinking is part of that existence. It doesn't take much to realize that. That's all you need to say. There is no refutation to that. And then what it's about understanding how people can get confused in an argument, how that we can't argue subjectivity versus objectivity, because the objectivity exists right there. You're basing it on an argument. You're having the conversation. Are you saying you don't know? Or are you saying that you don't believe subjectivity to that level? That same level is, it may be implied that the other person may be saying against you. You just believe subjectivity based on, oh, I subjectively feel this pain and that pain, and he's arguing that there is an objective truth or whatever it may be. Obviously, we come to a consensus. Yes, we live in an objective world. I have my subjective opinions. That doesn't mean everything is subjective. It just means it's a matter of, almost in a way of funneling the argument in one direction and making sure everything's understood. But yes, it exists, but it exists independently, but it's still objective. It doesn't mean everything's subjective. It's objective. It can't be subjective. It can't be all made up to you. But objectively, regardless of just you, it would be an objective thing. Regardless of that, because apparently you're the only one making up the reality, but you understand it's in a real world. Therefore, even if you're just making it up, it's subjective. It's still objective because it's happening. It's happening. And regardless of that, your subjective opinion, it doesn't matter because your subjective opinion doesn't change the fact that it's an objective world. So how does this confusion happen? Everything's subjective, but it has to be subjective to something, subjected to something, subjected to something that's objectively existing in reality. Just because a ball hit you in the head or whatever it may be doesn't mean it's objectively happened to you, but it objectively existed, making all these weird distinctions. And it existed objectively and it happened to you, and you had a subjective experience in your own mind. But even if it was created by your own mind, it was still objective. You created an objective world, like hallucinations or whatever it may be, something created in your own mind. Even if the whole world was created by your own mind, it's still objective because it's still happening, it's still affecting a thing that can feel and understand the reality. Regardless, it would be there. And if it wasn't, if you weren't there anymore, it would still existed objectively. It's just not existing anymore. Hallucinations, you creating a world in your head, it's still objective. It's still happening. There's an objective, but there's no subject. It's subjective with a subject based on your own liking, your opinions, and your perception, your projections, but it's an objective of understanding that there's an objective reality. But there's no subjective reality. That doesn't make any sense. It can't exist any other way. Pain can exist to a certain degree. It's, yes, you have a personal taste, opinion, but that doesn't mean everything's all of a sudden subjective. You can't be objective and subjective, other than subjective exists inside the objective. That's all. It exists inside the objective. And then the fact that you, like, subjective reality, but it exists objectively. No, let alone the very fact that you're basing it off of something and you're having a conversation based on an agreed interpersonal subjectivity. No, it exists. The tree did fall in the forest. The person did feel that pain. Even if you didn't feel the pain, doesn't mean that it didn't exist in them. You realize that there's a them and a you, and there's a difference, but exist in the same world, right? Are you saying they don't exist? Well, that exists. That delusion in your head exists, right? I mean, you're just going to go in circles here. It exists. I mean, sort of like paradoxes I've mentioned before. They don't exist. It's just a confusion of contradictory ideas that you can confuse and make them not contradict. I mean, these things don't exist. They exist only as a confusion of reality, confusing simple, basic arguments, and not knowing where the other side's coming from. It's easy to understand this stuff. It's just about the argument. The subjective, objective, that stuff exists already, okay? And, understanding. It's about making the argument to convince the other person. And that's more important than anything. And understanding these basic concepts and differences between subjective, objective, and living life, and knowing the differences and the fact that there is a layer to these things, you need to realize that yes, these things can be argued and defended on the right side. I mean, you can't argue and defend the non-truth because it's just going to either create a falsity, a paradox, or whatever. It's going to create a dead-end argument. So that's where you have to realize, oh yeah, I need to get them on that before they start confusing more, and before long, everything just becomes a big blur. Realize, yes, we understand it's based on something. We need to argue from that point on and convince this person that doesn't seem to know what the fuck they're talking about, that what they're fucking talking about doesn't make any sense, and then convince them of the right side, at least almost in a way subconsciously, or fooling them into believing it because it's just a matter of denial. And there's no way you can not understand that this is objective. This is objective. Every subconscious thing that you talk about, oh, this happened. Is it just to you, or are you trying to convince them? All of a sudden you say it in a personal subjective agreement, all of a sudden you're trying to convince them the subjective thing happened? No, it happened, regardless of your subjectivity opinion, or whatever it may be that you're trying to convince someone else. It didn't happen unless it already happened. And regardless of it happening only to you, it still objectively happened. But it didn't just happen to you, it happened outside of you. It's not just, oh, it's happening to me and happening to them. My mind is independent. Well, your mind is independent in a dependent world that creates the dependency. We're dependent on things and it's dependent on an independent. We think we're independent, but we're not. We're dependent based on every interaction that happens around us. And just because it's just in you, even if you were just a brain in a vat doing all this stuff, it's still objective. This whole difference between like all of a sudden it's in your head, all of a sudden there's a different layer of reasoning that you can apply to subjective, that like it's creating a reality, but it's like subjective almost means creating a reality based on your own thoughts. But your thoughts are still objective, even if they were the only thing creating a world outside of you. I mean, if a brain in a vat creating the world, it's still objective. We're not saying that's not true. It's objective, and it's in your subjective mind, your subjective experience, I think, is best to be applied to subjectivity. But it's existing in an objective world where all these things are happening, regardless of your recognition or your denial or whatever it may be. It exists regardless of that delusion you have in your brain or your perception. It exists, and we both know it. It's just a matter of concealing or Trojan horsing the argument, or trying to convince or um, apply, uh, have the right way to apply the argument against the person, getting the back and forth correct, because it's a back and forth that's confusing people. You don't reinforce what you're saying and you already believe based on a disliking of what a person's saying. You need to find a way to conceal the argument, or at least have a common understanding of an argument and not rely on straw men or whatever and hominin and having that create the argument for you based on a hate you have for someone and using the same points. It's about tackling it if you don't think the point's working, but realizing that you're arguing for nothing when you argue that this subjectivity, it doesn't mean anything because it all objectively exists. Your subjective experience based on your one being, yes, it exists, but it exists based on an objective world that you're living in subjectively. And every subconscious thing, like I mentioned before, is based off of an objective reality. You say, oh, this happened, that happened, right? Do I need to ask you if it happened? No, it already happened. It happened in reality. The tree fell in the forest. It's intersubjective. It's not intersubjective. It exists regardless. Subjective and objective can exist in the same world, but subjective doesn't really mean anything. And that's almost in a way to say that, yes, it's not a paradox. It's just realizing that subjective has far less meaning than you want to put to it. So regardless, that's all I need to say on this subject. If I have anything else to say on the subject, I can mention in another video some other time. But thank you, and until next time. Bye.